This is Chapter 6, Part 2. The U.S. attempts to control the production of illicit drugs in foreign countries through diplomatic programs. This is referred to as certification. So this is, a softer kind of approach in working with other countries. This was started by Congress in 1986. Certification is a process in which the United States government evaluates the cooperation of foreign countries in counter-drug efforts. If a country is decertified, U.S. law requires that all foreign aid be withheld. Okay, so what they do, and again, look at the details of this sort of thing in the textbook, but what the country does, what the U.S. government does, is that every year it comes up with a list of countries that are producing a lot of drugs. And then it will divide those countries, it'll decide which countries are cooperating with the United States and sincerely trying to work with us in reducing the drug problem, the drug cultivation and production and distribution problem, of these drugs that coming from those countries in the United States. If a country's working with us and cooperating with us, fine, we continue to give them foreign aid. If they're not working and cooperating with us, and we decertify them, and then they lose their foreign aid. So it's a little bit of it's a diplomatic, softer sort of approach in trying to get countries to help us and work with us fighting this global drug problem. Now, opponents argue that decertification serves merely as an international, quote, scorecard with little or no impact on the worldwide illicit drug supply or the global illicit drug trade. So that's what the critics would say, that this kind of sounds good on paper, but it's a diplomacy thing and it doesn't really have any teeth, it doesn't bite. Sometimes the U.S. government wants to work with these other countries for other reasons, like, for example, in recent years, Venezuela has been a non-cooperative country. But we've gone ahead and, maybe get them foreign aid anyway for other reasons, because there's a lot more in our relations with other countries than just the drug issue. And so, some people just say, it doesn't really work very well. Drug interdiction. Now, lots of terms in this chapter. Make sure that you understand what these terms are. I like to target those for testing purposes. Drug interdiction means denying drug traffickers the use of air, land, or maritime routes in order to prevent illicit drugs from being smuggled across the borders. So we're talking about fighting smuggling over the border into the United States. Interdiction, it means getting in the way, blocking that, stopping that from happening. In recent years, changes in airport security have caused the traffickers to stop smuggling drugs through the airports and instead direct their drugs shipments over land routes. A lot of this has to do with post 9/11. Before 9/11, security in airports was not as tight. It got much, much tighter after 9/11, making it much more difficult for drug traffickers to sneak drugs over the border through airports, through planes, etc. They used to be done a lot, not so much now because it's harder in airports. Less likely to get caught if you're sneaking it across the border. Most of the smuggling occurs at the U.S.-Mexico border. Of course, the textbook mentions how we've got thousands of miles of border with Canada as well as Mexico, but it's for historical reasons, for variety of reasons, it's much more of a problem coming from the south, coming across the U.S.-Mexican border, where drug traffickers use various strategies ranging from concealed compartments in cars, minivans, and trucks, commercial trucks, big trucks, different size trucks, to secret underground tunnels. Of course, there's a lot of money to be made here, so these people work very hard and they attract pretty, fairly smart people to figure out ways to get around officials at the border and to sneak these drugs into the United States. The primary federal agencies involved in drug interdiction include the DEA, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE agency, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection CBP agency, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. military. Now, I have students quite often come to me saying, Professor Hoskin, I'd really like to, work at the federal level in something law enforcement. But the thing is, people always think FBI. And that's always the first agency and maybe the only agency that gets mentioned. Folks need to realize, if you're one of these students interested in this kind of career, great, but realize that the FBI is really sort of considered the cream of the crop. It's the most competitive. Since everybody's thinking about the same agency working for the FBI, you have a tremendous number of applicants for each job opening available. So it's extremely competitive. So you folks would be wise to consider that there's dozens of federal agencies that do law enforcement work. Law enforcement work that is very similar, that's very important to what the FBI does. Very similar. FBI has works to fight drugs, so do these other agencies that we just covered. And so just keep in mind that there's a lot of agencies out there, and that the chances are significantly better with some of these other agencies to be able to secure that employment, to get that job. So just keep these other agencies in mind. I'm not going to take time during this lecture to go through each one of these agencies and describe, lots of different things about it. Take a look in the textbook to go over these. To some extent, you'll get an idea of what these agencies do based on their names. But take a look, see the sort of things that they do, and especially do so if you've got possibly some career interest in this area, because there are a lot of opportunities there. Drug law enforcement agents have developed drug courier profiles to help the identification of potential drug traffickers. In the United States versus Sokolow, back in 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the drug courier profiles at airports could be used as a legitimate law enforcement tool. So basically what we're doing is, based on the drug traffickers that have been apprehended, that have been convicted, the government will develop a profile and say that these are the sorts of individuals who are more likely than other people to be involved in drug trafficking. So they come up with a list of characteristics that could help you flag a person in an airport, for example, or in some other situation, to a port of entry, crossing into the United States through a port of entry or something with a vehicle, something, whatever, that there's certain things that they will look for that have been correlated with being a drug trafficker. The U.S. Supreme Court has said that creating these profiles at airports could be a legitimate and accepted law enforcement tool. But this approach has critics, and one of the main criticisms of profiling is that officers might rely heavily on, visible characteristics like the appearance of somebody and, looking for race and ethnicity in the individuals, and relying on that as being some sort of indicator, a signal that perhaps someone could be involved in drug trafficking. Well, if you're focusing on race, that's called racial profiling, and is a controversial sort of strategy. Now, let me just say that a lot of the characteristics that are used in these profiles are not controversial, are something that most people would agree is acceptable. If there's certain sorts of especially behavior. If there are certain things like clothing, or certain kind of things that a person is wearing, could be somewhat acceptable to a lot of people. but in particular, what most people would agree are profiling characteristics that are not unfair, that seem to be reasonable, would be behavior. If you're acting really nervous, you really, not comfortable, if you're behaving in a way that's erratic, that just doesn't make sense, that most of the time, that sort of behavioral profile, behavioral characteristics are perfectly fine to look at. But the controversy often is that if officers are zeroing in instead on the way a person looks, and particularly race, ethnicity, that this is unacceptable and shouldn't be allowed. So it's made the whole issue of sort of profiling in criminal justice in general kind of a controversial subject. In 2003, under Department of Justice directive, racial and ethnic profiling was officially banned at all federal agencies with law enforcement powers. And so this sort of heavy focus on race, ethnicity was banned at the federal level back in 2003. So it was decided by the Department of Justice that this sort of thing is improper if you're focusing on race and ethnicity. The textbook cites a number of cases which report racial bias in police stops and searches. Okay, and so I'm not going to take the time to go over those individual ones because, again, it's sort of to really treat those with justice. You need to go over all the methods and the details of the studies and look at strengths and weaknesses of them. It's really hard to evaluate a whole bunch of studies or just a list of studies. Difficult to do that. But one thing I do want to say as a more general point, to offer a little bit of a pushback on the textbook, is that the textbook here on looking at drugs and law enforcement stresses the evidence of racial bias coming out of studies at who's being stopped, who's being searched, and that seeing a correlation between race and sort of how you're being treated by law enforcement officials in terms of especially things like being stopped, being searched, being arrested, etc. And then in this chapter we're talking about law enforcement. The same sort of thing applies later on in the system, whether you're talking about at the level of being charged, being tried, being convicted, sentencing, all of that. There's been a lot of studies, since the 1960s, looking at the issue of racial bias, and it's a big central theme that comes up in a lot of these criminal justice classes. Let me just issue a little bit of caution that yes, these studies often find racial bias, but we have to understand that a lot of these studies are done using quite simple research methods, and there has been a tendency to find that the more sophisticated study, the more variables that you look at, you tend to find that race and ethnicity becomes less of a glaring factor. The racial bias tends to shrink as the studies get more sophisticated. And the reason for that is very simple. It's just that if you see a correlation, if you see a certain racial group being stopped more than another racial group, that does not necessarily mean that there is bad. There's like malevolence being on the part of the officers involved, that they don't like the group that they're dealing with, that there's racial animus, racial hostility, or at a lower level stereotyping, or just a subconscious bias or something like that. Those are all possible explanations, or partial explanations for why you might see a racial difference in who's getting stopped or who's getting searched. See, but those are only some possibilities. There's many, many, many things, a long list of things that are correlated with race and ethnicity. Many things, not just being treated in a biased way. There's many things correlated with race and ethnicity. And often these studies do not consider these other possibilities. They just zero in on they'll look at racial gap. If they see a difference in rates of getting stopped, then they attribute that. They conclude, oh, therefore you have a racist system because you see different rates of people being stopped. Well, we don't know for sure based on that data what's going on, why people are being stopped at a higher rate in this group than that group. There's lots of possibilities, and very often these studies don't explore all possibilities. They're a little too simple in assuming assuming racism instead of looking deeper into, is that really what's going on, or are there other things going on? Are there many things going on? So that's just a little note of caution about this question of bias in the criminal justice system. Now, I'm not saying that don't misinterpret me here. I'm not saying that there's not bias. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that just the studies, we have to sort of interpret them with a little bit of caution because we still have a long way to go to make the studies more sophisticated and look at lots of things to see what really is making a big difference and what's not. So that's all it is just a word of caution. Looks like we've run out of time for part 2. We'll pick this up in part 3.